Hello and welcome to something slightly different this week. Today we're going to be going through a history of the scenery of Warhammer Fantasy. Just so it's not just me that you're staring at, whilst I'm talking about this, I'm going to be building some of the scenery that you got in the 5th edition starter box. So I've got here a stack of cardboard, I've got here my instruction manual that came with the 5th edition set. Let's get down to it. First things first, I'm going to push out the walls. As you may see, this is cardstock scenery. For a long time, cardstock scenery was one of the only ways that you could get scenery for Warhammer Fantasy, short of building your own. The first set of cardstock scenery that I'm aware of came when they released the 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy box set. That came with kind of a precursor to the cardboard tower and cardboard house that I'm going to be building here today. And I'll throw up a picture of that in just a second. There we are. Need to apply a little bit of glue to this. While I'm gluing that, take a look at this. So this was the 4th edition starter set, and as you can see, it came with a cardboard tower. It came with a cardboard house, but it's a little bit different to the cardboard house and cardboard tower that I'm building here today. This was, I guess, kind of the genesis of cardboard scenery in Warhammer. They'd done diagrams before then of how to make your own, guidelines that you could cut out and build at home. But this was the stuff that they first provided with a box set, and from there they then went on to produce another set of cardboard scenery that you could buy, which was essentially a whole empire town. There we go, that's nicely glued together. Next step, make the steps. Ooh, let's find the steps. The cardboard town was essentially a pack of a whole bunch of different cardboard buildings that you could, much like I'm doing now, press out from a pre-cut piece of card. Ooh, come on. There you go. And this one looks quite tricky. You could then put them together in line with the instructions and essentially end up with a whole village for your scenery for games of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So I think that pushes through there. I'll use my craft knife to push that out, and then there's going to be some gluing involved. It proved very popular, and so when they released the 5th edition starter set, they produced yet more cardboard scenery that you could build as you went. Oh, there we go, that goes together quite nicely. If you're not completely cack-handed like me, then it would go together like that. That's going to push in to there by the looks of things, so let's pop those bits out. After they had done the cardboard scenery set for building essentially an Empire village, then they did the 5th edition starter box. After they'd produced this starter box, you got a slightly more updated version of the cardboard keep and an updated version of the wooden house. You'll see the finished pieces of those at the end when I finished building them. They then released some of my favourite sets. They released the 4 campaign packs that they released for Warhammer Fantasy. Those were the Circle of Blood, which I'll be doing a video on at some point, because I love it so much. Grudge of Drong, Perilous Quest, Idol of Gork, and Tears of Isha. So five campaign sets that they released. Where do you go in? Oh, there we go. And there. That's not too bad. Top's coming unglued, but there we go. Little cardboard tower with some steps. Next, to do the parapet. Circle of Blood and the other campaign sets all came with cardstock scenery that was relevant to the scenario. So Circle of Blood came with the graveyard for the first scenario, it came with a magical wizarding tower for the second scenario. Stop it. And more glue. It came with a bridge for the 3rd scenario and a cardboard tomb for the 3rd scenario. So really it came with everything you needed to play the game, short of the miniatures. Idol of Gork, on the other hand, almost all of the scenery contained in Idol of Gork was intended for the very first scenario. It was some cardboard idols and a ruined orc, a ruined Empire watchtower that the orcs had taken over as their kind of base. And you only really needed those for the first scenario. Grudge of Drong is much the same. The scenery that came in Grudge of Drong, I'm just going to hold that while I talk to you for a little bit. The scenery that came in Grudge of Drong was pretty much only for the 3rd scenario, the Brewhouse Bash, whereas Perilous Quest, I think there was scenery for the jousting ground at the start, and then there was a cart that you had to make. That wasn't just card scenery, that also came with some wheels that you could attach to it to make a little kind of reliquary cart that was being transported through the forest that the Wood Elves waylaid. So it kind of overturns of Robin Hood there. Except there's only one Robin Hood, and it's Bertrand the Brigand. White Dwarf also released a little bit of cardboard scenery at that point, which you could use to make a watchtower for Gorka Morka and some buildings for 40k. I know there was a whole bunch of really awesome scenery, cardboard scenery released for 40k. I'm going to mention that in a future video. You'll see why, because I want to get Mike involved on that, because he has some awesome stuff for that. So that's where scenery was at by the end of 5th edition. There was the cardboard scenery you got in the starter box, then the cardboard scenery you got in all 5 of the campaign pack. The only other thing that was really available around the time of 5th ed that you would use alongside this cardboard scenery was trees. Trees back then, as you may have seen us discussed in one of the campaign videos, looked like this. They were a loo brush basically on a plastic stand covered in flock, and yeah, Murray needs to get himself a whole bunch of these for his Wood Elves. Hills, I mean at that point hills were basically done by way of either carving them yourself out of polystyrene or sticking a book under the tablecloth, which was my old trick. I'm going to move on while that's gluing, hopefully it stays put, to the parapet for this. But so what I want to mention then is the next kind of innovation that came in scenery for Warhammer Fantasy when 6th edition came out. First of all, you got the Mordheim box set came out. Mordheim is an awesome, awesome game that is well worthy of its own video. But within that was, much like I'm building here, cardstock scenery, but with an added advantage that it came with, come on, there we are, it came with plastic additions. So you had little plastic windows, plastic edge strips that would glue down, and where I've got this edge desperately holding on with Pritt stick at the moment, I would then have been able to protect it with a plastic edging strip that was modelled up to look like little bricks that would give some extra rigidity and stability to the building. So this was a real kind of an advancing cardstock scenery. It was a hybrid kit, and yeah, I've got some of those lying around somewhere. I might see if I can put one of those edging strips on one of these towers maybe, just to see how it looks and give it a little bit of extra durability so that I can take it with me for games. After the Mordheim scenery came out, the other big innovation that came for... Can you go on top? Yes, you go on top. The other big innovation that came for scenery was the advent of plastic hills. I'm sure many old grognards like me out there will remember fondly the plastic doobries, as we called them. This is an English word for anybody who's not come across it from elsewhere in the wider world. A doobry was a plastic flat cone, essentially. It was a bit like a cone that had been stood on you'd have on the sports field, and the plastic hills looked basically like that. They were a flock covered plastic moulded vacuum formed plastic hill that was also equally convenient when you turned it upside down for holding your dice. But they came along during 6th edition, and not long after that were the next really kind of big innovations for scenery within, that should hold, Warhammer Fantasy, and that was plastic trees. So they released a variant of the plastic tree. These were a bit of a nuisance to build, you know, so you got 3 of them in a box, plastic frame, and then a whole bunch of branches you had to glue in, and then leaves that you just kind of balanced like some kind of I don't know, Jenga game on top of the branches and glued on for a weird look. I personally still much prefer these flocked trees, which of course you can still get from model shops and stuff. But the further innovation that came after the plastic trees was a real kind of rush of building materials that came out. There was the vacuum formed plastic, that needs a bit of glue on, no, it's got a bit of glue on there. The vacuum formed plastic graveyard set they did, and Forge World got in on the act with a vacuum formed plastic orc village, which there are a few of those still out there in the wild. They also did a moulded kind of plastic set of walls and basically hedgerows, which were just kind of the same stuff you get on pan scourers, packed with flock, much like these trees, and then packaged in some set sections that you could just lay out on the battlefield to make walls. This was almost kind of producing stuff that you could do at home, but that they made available to you essentially as a labour-saving technique. There we are, that's that. I think that then just gets glued on the top of that. So I'll leave that there for the minute, and I'll start building the little cottage while we keep talking. I mentioned the little cottage. That was, of course, the next stage that came along within Warhammer scenery after the vacuum-formed scenery, and that was the multi-part plastic buildings. You may have seen one hiding on the shelf just behind me here, and I think what's quite cool is they did 2 sets, which is very much kind of the evolution of the tower and the cottage that I'm building here. They did a plastic temple, shrine, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it looks an awful lot like the cardboard cottage that I'm going to be making here, and they also did a plastic tower, which doesn't look too unusual when you put the two of them side by side like that. After they had done... Where does that bit go? I don't know where that bit goes. Is that a different bit? Oh, that's the shack! I'm making the cottage. That's the roof of the shack. Oh, God. This is what happens if you don't follow the instructions because you're too busy enthusing about old school scenery. Okay, fine. We'll make the cottage, then we'll make the shack. 3 bits of scenery in this one. So that's the roof, and that's going to be the hip section, it says. So that was when scenery really kind of went wild. That's when the Games Workshop started making a whole bunch of really massive plastic scenery pieces. So whereas before we'd had the tower and the cottage, which I've got behind me, and the two of them were then also released as a combined set with some plastic walls and a joining section, essentially, so you could make the whole lot into a fortified manor, which I've got one of down in the box down here, and I'll need to get that painted at some point. They also then started cranking out things like ruined towers, wizards' towers with crazy names like Witchfate Tor and Tower of Sorcery. They produced the Garden of Moor, an entire graveyard kit that was really a quantum leap on from the vacuum-formed plastic kits that they'd done before, which were kind of pre-painted and with flock on. These ones were multi-part plastic kits that you could make an entire mausoleum out of. They were great for both your games of fantasy and if you were still playing playing Mordheim, the fantasy version of Necromunda. If you were still playing Mordheim, then you could use them as part of the scenery for your kind of downed city. They also then produced the slightly more bizarre forms of scenery, like these massive pieces. This was around the time of 8th edition fantasy when they started having essentially a metagame version of fantasy where you had, much like Apocalypse in 40k, you had huge mega spells and you'd have massed armies with huge amounts of monsters. And for that they produced things like spiralling towers of staircases that led up to platforms that wizards could stand on and engage in duels, or huge kind of skull-mounted thrones. And one of my all-time favourite pieces, they produced a massive hill with kind of bits of ruined temple on and chaos spikes rising off it that formed a major centerpiece for a board if you wanted to use it. Slightly less impressive but still very cool around that time, we also then got a new version of the vacuum formed hill. So this was again, it was a single piece model, a bit like the plastic Dubry, but an evolution on it. And it had one major advantage over the Dubry. It was that the Dubry, whilst it had a flat top, getting models, especially models that was on a square basis on a movement tray, to stay without falling off that old style plastic hill was a bit of a nuisance. This at least had a decent sized flat top that you could fit a couple of units or some artillery on, and the sides, once you got off this stepped rock section, the sides weren't so badly sloped that a unit on a movement tray wouldn't stay put, basically, as long as they had a bit of friction at the bottom from the gaming mat or whatever else you had. Also around that time, they produced, bear with me, Realm of Battle tiles. So these were an evolution on, I guess, from the stepped hills, that they were an entire 2x2 square section of sculpted scenic board. 6 of these came in a pack. You got 4... I've just knocked the top of the tower. You got 4 of them that were done with a stepped hill on the corner, and then 2 of them with a flat section. And the idea was you could arrange them however you want. You could arrange it with kind of a hill on each side, or a hill in the corner, or a hill in the middle, and a flat section on the side. There was whatever combination you wanted. I loved those, and I wish they still did them. I know now we've moved to either cloth or cardboard mats, and then scenery sat on top, but I really love the Realm of Battle tiles, and I wish they were still available. That appears to have dried, so I'm just going to grab myself the walls for my cottage. I'll put my tower top back on. I'm going to mention a dirty word now, and that is 3 dirty words. In fact, it's Age of Sigmar. I know that I said this was the history of scenery in fantasy, but it is worthy of mention. Age of Sigmar is the natural follow-on from Warhammer Fantasy, at least until the Old World game comes back out. And it has given us some more great scenery pieces. I mean, I've talked about my love for the bottle brush trees, my less enthusiasm for these weird Jenga-esque trees. A second pass that they made on the Jenga trees, which is much better, is the Wildwood trees. Now these were produced for the Sylvaneth army, but I mean you can use them in any game for trees. They are, instead of the weird balancing leaves on a branch approach, they are leaves attached to a branch of a trio of trees that can be arranged in any format you want. You can put them in a little grove with a sort of circular section in the middle. You can do them scattered across the field, but they are, I think, a very pretty piece of kit, and they do stand quite nicely compared to these trees that you had to clip into a base with 3 rounded holes in the middle. I still think these are the superior tree, but that's just me. Let's move trees to one side for a minute. But also, Age of Sigmar gave us a whole bunch of other scenery pieces. As well as the wildwood trees, we got a whole range of army-specific terrains. Some of it great, some of it less so. I'm not particularly enamoured of the weird, random, in the middle of the battlefield forge that the Fire Slayers got, for example. But I do have considerable affection for the wrecked ship that the Deep King got. I think that's a great piece of scenery, that whether you're playing in a game of Age of Sigmar, or if you just want to have something that looks like a ruined ship on a tide line. I've got some of it in a box down here. I was very fortunate. A friend of mine actually gifted me a whole bunch of Age of Sigmar scenery. I'll give her a quick wave now. Hi, Pamela! And I've still got a lot of that, I confess, to build and paint, because I'm only just getting into playing Age of Sigmar. But that, again, I think it set the tone for Age of Sigmar in terms of much more of a high fantasy, weird aesthetic, rather than the kind of grimdark, gothic look that we got from versions 6, 7 and 8 of Warhammer Fantasy. That looks like it's holding. Let's try and stick the roof on. Bear with me, back in a sec. Okay, object lesson here is do not try and rush building cardboard scenery for the purposes of a YouTube video, because I am now covered in glue. The tower stuck. I'm calling that a success. I'm going to say that I am slightly defeated by this cottage. I am going to call the tower a win, because that's pretty much there. And if this glue dries, I'll try and stick some of the little shields around the outside just to make it look decorative, so it can sit next to my Bretonnians in the cabinet. I want to just talk a little bit more about where scenery's at the moment. I think one of the things that's quite cool is that Age of Sigmar has opened up a wave of different things that they can do with scenery. In terms of 5th edition and 6th edition and 7th, 8th fantasy, I pledge my allegiance. I absolutely love the old world, but it did limit somewhat what you could have in terms of what fit within that world. So whilst you got some fairly amazing things like the huge astronomer's tower, or like I said, the ruined chaos shrine on top of a hill, that was kind of the outlier of what they could produce for Warhammer Fantasy. Age of Sigmar, we've got all the amazing scenery that they've been producing for Warcry. It's a smeltery in the heart of the Varanberg. It's a swamp filled with corrupted trees. It's giant skeletons that they've produced for long dead creatures. And this is stuff that I don't think we would have seen if we had stayed in the old world. It's not to say it's not stuff that you couldn't still use in your games of Warhammer Fantasy, though I think some of it would not work so well with square bases of movement trays. But still, the Chaos Smeltery would look equally good alongside a Chaos Dwarf army as perhaps the heart of some Chaos Dwarven citadel that was being fought over. The giant bones of the dead Magmadroth would equally work great in some kind of Khemri board, or in the wastes where the Zombie Dragon's bones were found, or even the Badlands. I might get one of those and just use it at the next Warhammer Fantasy Badlands campaign, because it's just so cool, and I think it would look awesome with armies fighting over the remains of some vast ancient Drake beast. But what I think is also very cool is how far scenery has come from the cardboard stuff that I'm currently clutching in my hands here, through the different changes in technology and the different things Games Workshop were willing to experiment with, some of which were a success, some were less so. But I think that it's nice to have been on this journey with them, and it's nice to be trying my hands and failing and gluing myself to some of this cardboard scenery here. And I can't wait to see what they come out with next. I will throw up a little bit at the end of this video, hopefully if I manage to get this house to glue itself together. But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time. I'm still waiting for the glue to dry. A brief shameless plug. My subscribers hit 350 this week. I was having a bit of a bad week. It was a bit of a low point for me, and it was one of those just nice moments that kind of lifted me up, and I know this sounds corny, it really did kind of buoy me to know that there were people out there who were appreciating something that I was doing. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everybody who's subscribed to the channel. Thank you for everybody who leaves me really nice comments. And I can't wait to share what I've got coming up next with you. If you've not already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. It genuinely does make me feel appreciated. It makes me want to keep pressing on with this when I've got a busy workload in my day job and I don't feel like cracking the camera out. But knowing there are people out there who want to share my crazy takes on my hobby with me makes me feel good. So yeah, thanks everyone. Catch you next time. I am glued to this, but not in a good way. Just putting some finishing touches on here. I've got the little shields cut out for the tower, so I'm just going to stick some of these going around the outer edge. What's kind of nice is there's some optional extras that came with this, so there's an alternative door that you can use on the cottage, should you so wish. A little bit similar to what came with the plastic multi-part cottage a few years later. Ah, stuck to me. Don't stick to me, stick to the tower. Should have got my 8-year-old to do this. Far better. One tower, one cottage, one tower, one cottage. I'm going to throw up a glamour shot of this in a minute, just posed it up with the first month's painted Bretonians, and we'll see how it all looks.